8. Charity and Poverty. A common complaint is that the free market would not ensure the elimination of poverty, that it would leave people free to starve, and that it is far better to be kind-hearted and give charity free rein by taxing the rest of the populace in order to subsidize the poor and the substandard. In the first place, the freedom to starve argument confuses the war against nature, which we all conduct, with the problem of freedom from interference by other persons. We are always free to starve unless we pursue our conquest of nature, for that is our natural condition. But freedom refers to absence of molestation by other persons. It is purely an interpersonal problem. Secondly, it should also be clear that it is precisely voluntary exchange and free capitalism that have led to an enormous improvement in living standards. Capitalist production is the only method by which poverty can be wiped out. As we stressed, production must come first, and only freedom allows people to produce in the best and most efficient way possible. Force and violence may distribute, but it cannot produce. Intervention hampers production, and socialism cannot calculate. Since production of consumer satisfactions is maximized on the free market is the only way to abolish poverty. Dictates and legislation cannot do so. In fact, they can only make matters worse. The appeal to charity is a truly ironic one. First, it is hardly charity to take wealth by force and hand it over to someone else. Indeed, this is the direct opposite of charity, which can only be an unbought, voluntary act of grace. Compulsory confiscation can only deaden charitable desires completely, as the wealthier grumble that there is no point in giving to charity when the state has already taken on the task. This is another illustration of the truth that men can become more moral only through rational persuasion, not through violence, which will, in fact, have the opposite effect. Furthermore, since the state is always inefficient, the amount and direction of the giving will be much different from what it would be if people were left free to act on their own. If the state decides from whom to take and to whom to give, the power residing in the state's hands is enormous. It is obvious that political unfortunates will be the ones whose property is confiscated, and political favorites the ones subsidized. And in the meantime, the state erects a bureaucracy whose living is acquired by feeding off the confiscation of one group and the encouraged mendicancy of another. Other consequences follow from a regime of compulsory charity. For one thing, the poor, or the deserving poor, have been exalted as a privileged caste, with an enforceable claim to the production of the more able. This is a far cry from a request for charity. Instead, the able are penalized and enslaved by the state, and the unable are placed on a moral pedestal. Certainly this is a peculiar sort of moral program. The further consequence will be to discourage the able, to reduce production and saving in all of society, and beyond this, to subsidize the creation of a caste of poor. Not only will the poor be subsidized by right, but their ranks will be encouraged to multiply, both through reproduction and through their moral exaltation and subsidization. The able will be correspondingly hampered and repressed. Whereas the opportunity for voluntary charity acts as a spur to production by the able, Coerced charity acts as a drain and a burden upon production. In fact, in the long run, the greatest charity is precisely not what we know by that name, but rather simple, selfish capital investment and the search for technological innovations. Poverty has been tamed by the enterprise and the capital investment of our ancestors, most of which was undoubtedly done for selfish motives. This is a fundamental illustration of the truth enunciated by Adam Smith, that we generally help others most in those very activities in which we help ourselves. Statists, in fact, are really opposed to charity. They often argue that charity is demeaning and degrading to the recipient, and that he should therefore be taught that the money is rightly his, to be given to him by the government as his due. But this oft-felt degradation stems, as Isabel Patterson pointed out, from the fact that the recipient of charity is not self-supporting on the market, and that he is out of the production circuit and no longer providing a service in exchange for one received. However, granting him the moral and legal right to mulct his fellows increases his moral degradation instead of ending it, for the beneficiary is now further removed from the production line than ever. An act of charity, when given voluntarily, is generally considered temporary and offered with the object of helping a man to help himself. But when the dole is ladled out by the state, it becomes permanent and perpetually degrading, keeping the recipients in a state of subservience. We are not attempting to argue at this point that to be subservient in this way is degrading. We simply say that anyone who considers private charity degrading must logically conclude that state charity is far more so. The devotion of government to charity may be gauged by its universal repression of mendicancy. A direct gift to a beggar helps the recipient directly and leaves no opportunity for large bureaucratic organizations to live full-time off the transaction. Harassment of direct aid, then, functions as a grant of monopolistic privilege to the official charity organizations. Isabel Patterson points out that the American government imposed a requirement of minimum cash assets for immigrants as an alleged way of helping the poorer immigrants. The actual effect, of course, was to keep the poorest immigrants who could not meet the requirement from American shores and economic opportunity. Mises, furthermore, points out that free market exchange, always condemned by statists for being impersonal and unfeeling, is precisely the relation that avoids all degradation and subservience. 9. The charge of selfish materialism. One of the most common charges leveled against the free market, even by many of its friends, is that it reflects and encourages unbridled, selfish materialism. Even if the free market, unhampered capitalism, best furthers man's material ends, critics argue, it distracts man from higher ideals. It leads man away from spiritual or intellectual values and atrophies any spirit of altruism. In the first place, there is no such thing as an economic end. Economy is simply a process of applying means to whatever ends a person may adopt. An individual can aim at any ends he pleases, selfish or altruistic. Other psychic factors being equal, it is to everyone's self-interest to maximize his monetary income on the market. But this maximum income can then be used for selfish or for altruistic ends. Which ends people pursue is of no concern to the praxeologist. A successful businessman can use his money to buy a yacht or to build a home for destitute orphans. The choice rests with him. But the point is that whichever goal he pursues, he must first earn the money before he can attain the goal. Secondly, whichever moral philosophy we adopt, whether altruism or egoism, we cannot criticize the pursuit of monetary income on the market. If we hold an egoistic social ethic, then obviously we can only applaud the maximization of monetary income, or of a mixture of monetary and other psychic income on the market. There is no problem here. However, even if we adopt an altruistic ethic, we must applaud maximization of monetary income just as fervently, for market earnings are a social index of one's services to others, at least in the sense that any services are exchangeable. The greater a man's income, the greater has been his service to others. Indeed, it should be far easier for the altruist to applaud the maximization of a man's monetary income than that of his psychic income, when this is in conflict with the former goal. Thus, the consistent altruist must condemn the refusal of a man to work at a job paying high wages, and his preference for a lower-paying job somewhere else. This man, whatever his reason, is defying the signaled wishes of the consumers, his fellows in society. If, then, a coal miner shifts to a more pleasant but lower-paying job as a grocery clerk, the consistent altruist must castigate him for depriving his fellow man of needed benefits. For the consistent altruist must face the fact that monetary income on the market reflects services to others, whereas psychic income is a purely personal or selfish gain. This analysis applies directly to the pursuit of leisure. Leisure, as we have seen, is a basic consumer's good for mankind. Yet the consistent altruist would have to deny each worker any leisure at all, or at least deny every hour of leisure beyond what is strictly necessary to maintain his output, for every hour spent in leisure reduces the time a man can spend serving his fellows. The consistent advocates of consumers' sovereignty would have to favor enslaving the idler or the man who prefers following his own pursuits to serving the consumer. Rather than scorn pursuit of monetary gain, the consistent altruist should praise the pursuit of money on the market and condemn any conflicting non-monetary goals a producer may have, whether it be dislike for certain work, enthusiasm for work that pays less, or a desire for leisure. It is also peculiar that critics generally concentrate their fire on profits, the profit motive, and not on other market incomes, such as wages. It is difficult to see any sense whatever in moral distinctions between these incomes. Altruists who criticize monetary aims on the market, therefore, are wrong on their own terms. The charge of materialism is also fallacious. The market deals not necessarily in material goods, but in exchangeable goods. It is true that all material goods are exchangeable, except for human beings themselves. But there are also many non-material goods exchanged on the market. A man may spend his money on attending a concert or hiring a lawyer, for example, as well as on food or automobiles. There is absolutely no ground for saying that the market economy fosters either material or immaterial goods. It simply leaves every man free to choose his own pattern of spending. Finally, an advancing market economy satisfies more and more of people's desires for exchangeable goods. As a result, the marginal utility of exchangeable goods tends to decline over time, while the marginal utility of non-exchangeable goods increases. In short, the greater satisfaction of exchangeable values confers a much greater marginal significance on the non-exchangeable values. Rather than foster material values, then, advancing capitalism does just the opposite. 10. Back to the jungle? Many critics complain that the free market, in casting aside inefficient entrepreneurs or in other decisions, proves itself an impersonal monster. The free market economy, they charge, is the rule of the jungle, where survival of the fittest is the law. Libertarians who advocate a free market are therefore called social Darwinists who wish to exterminate the weak for the benefit of the strong. In the first place, these critics overlook the fact that the operation of the free market is vastly different from governmental action. When a government acts, individual critics are powerless to change the result. They can do so only if they can finally convince the rulers that their decision should be changed. This may take a long time or be totally impossible. On the free market, however, there is no final decision imposed by force. Everyone is free to shape his own decisions and thereby significantly change the results of the market. In short, whoever feels that the market has been too cruel to certain entrepreneurs or to other income receivers is perfectly free to set up an aid fund for suitable gifts and grants. Those who criticize existing private charity as being insufficient are perfectly free to fill the gap themselves. We must beware of hypostatizing the market as a real entity, a maker of inexorable decisions. The market is the resultant of the decisions of all individuals in the society. People can spend their money in any way they please and can make any decisions whatever concerning their persons and their property. They do not have to battle against or convince some entity known as the market before they can put their decisions into effect. The free market, in fact, is precisely the diametric opposite of the jungle society. The jungle is characterized by the war of all against all. One man gains only at the expense of another, by seizure of the latter's property. With all on a subsistence level, there is a true struggle for survival, with the stronger force crushing the weaker. In the free market, on the other hand, one man gains only through serving another, though he may also retire into self-sufficient production at a primitive level if he so desires. It is precisely through the peaceful cooperation of the market that all men gain through the development of the division of labor and capital investment. To apply the principle of the survival of the fittest to both the jungle and the market is to ignore the basic question, fitness for what? The fit in the jungle are those most adept at the exercise of brute force. The fit on the market are those most adept in the service of society. The jungle is a brutish place, where some seize from others and all live at the starvation level. The market is a peaceful and productive place where all serve themselves and others at the same time and live at infinitely higher levels of consumption. On the market, the charitable can provide aid, a luxury that cannot exist in the jungle. The free market, therefore, transmutes the jungle's destructive competition for meager subsistence into a peaceful, cooperative competition in the service of oneself and others. In the jungle, some gain only at the expense of others. On the market, everyone gains. It is the market, the contractual society, that wrests order out of chaos, that subdues nature and eradicates the jungle, that permits the weak to live productively, or out of gifts from production in a regal style compared to the life of the strong in the jungle. Furthermore, the market, by raising living standards, permits man the leisure to cultivate the very qualities of civilization that distinguish him from the brutes. It is precisely statism that is bringing back the rule of the jungle, bringing back conflict, disharmony, caste struggle, conquest, and the war of all against all, and general poverty. In place of the peaceful struggle of competition in mutual service, statism substitutes calculational chaos and the death struggle of social Darwinist competition for political privilege and for limited subsistence. 11. Power and coercion. A. Other forms of coercion. Economic power. A very common criticism of the libertarian position runs as follows. Of course, we do not like violence, and libertarians perform a useful service in stressing its dangers. But you are very simplistic because you ignore the other significant forms of coercion exercised in society, private coercive power, apart from the violence wielded by the state or the criminal. The government should stand ready to employ its coercion to check or offset this private coercion. In the first place, this seeming difficulty for libertarian doctrine may quickly be removed by limiting the concept of coercion to the use of violence. This narrowing would have the further merit of strictly confining the legalized violence of the police and the judiciary to the sphere of its competence, combating violence. But we can go even further, for we can show the inherent contradictions in the broader concept of coercion. A well-known type of private coercion is the vague but ominous-sounding economic power. A favorite illustration of the wielding of such power is the case of a worker fired from his job, especially by a large corporation. Is this not as bad as violent coercion against the property of the worker? Is this not another, subtler form of robbery of the worker, since he is being deprived of money that he would have received if the employer had not wielded his economic power? Let us look at this situation closely. What exactly has the employer done? He has refused to continue to make a certain exchange, which the worker preferred to continue making. Specifically, A, the employer, refuses to sell a certain sum of money in exchange for the purchase of B's labor services. B would like to make a certain exchange. A would not. The same principle may apply to all the exchanges throughout the length and breadth of the economy. A worker exchanges labor for money with an employer. A retailer exchanges eggs for money with a customer. A patient exchanges money with a doctor for his services, and so forth. Under a regime of freedom, where no violence is permitted, every man has the power either to make or not to make exchanges as and with whom he sees fit. Then, when exchanges are made, both parties benefit. We have seen that if an exchange is coerced, at least one party loses. It is doubtful whether even a robber gains in the long run, for a society in which violence and tyranny are practiced on a large scale will so lower productivity and become so much infected with fear and hate that even the robbers may be unhappy when they compare their lot with what it might be if they engaged in production and exchange in the free market. Economic power, then, is simply the right under freedom to refuse to make an exchange. Every man has this power. Every man has the same right to refuse to make a proffered exchange. Now, it should become evident that the middle-of-the-road statist, who concedes the evil of violence, but adds that the violence of government is sometimes necessary to counteract the private coercion of economic power, is caught in an impossible contradiction. A refuses to make an exchange with B. What are we to say, or what is the government to do, if B brandishes a gun and orders A to make the exchange? This is the crucial question. There are only two positions we may take on the matter. Either that B is committing violence and should be stopped at once, or that B is perfectly justified in taking this step because he is simply counteracting the subtle coercion of economic power wielded by A. Either the defense agency must rush to the defense of A, or it deliberately refuses to do so, perhaps aiding B or doing B's work for him. There is no middle ground. B is committing violence. There is no question about that. In the terms of both doctrines, this violence is either invasive and therefore unjust, or defensive and therefore just. If we adopt the economic power argument, we must choose the latter position. If we reject it, we must adopt the former. If we choose the economic power concept, we must employ violence to combat any refusal of exchange. If we reject it, we employ violence to prevent any violent imposition of exchange. There is no way to escape this either-or choice. The middle-of-the-road statist cannot logically say that there are many forms of unjustified coercion. He must choose one or the other and take his stand accordingly. Either he must say that there is only one form of illegal coercion, overt physical violence, or he must say that there is only one form of illegal coercion, refusal to exchange. We have already fully described the sort of society built on libertarian foundations, a society marked by peace, harmony, liberty, maximum utility for all, and progressive improvement in living standards. What would be the consequence of adopting the economic power premise? It would be a society of slavery. For what else is prohibiting the refusal to work? It would also be a society where the overt initiators of violence would be treated with kindness, while their victims would be upbraided as being really responsible for their own plight. Such a society would be truly a war of all against all, a world in which conquest and exploitation would rage unchecked. Let us analyze further the contrast between the power of violence and economic power, between, in short, the victim of a bandit and the man who loses his job with the Ford Motor Company. Let us symbolize in each case the alleged power wielder as P and the supposed victim as X. In the case of the bandit or robber, P plunders X. P lives, in short, by battening off X and all the other X's. This is the meaning of power in its original political sense. But what of economic power? Here, by contrast, X, the would-be employee, is asserting a strident claim to P's property. In this case, X is plundering P instead of the other way around. Those who lament the plight of the automobile worker who cannot obtain a job with Ford do not seem to realize that before Ford and without Ford there would be no such job to be obtained at all. No one, therefore, can have any sort of natural right to a Ford job, whereas it is meaningful to assert a natural right to liberty, a right which each person may have without depending on the existence of others, such as Ford. In short, the libertarian doctrine, which proclaims a natural right of defense against political power, is coherent and meaningful, but any proclaimed right of defense against economic power makes no sense at all. Here, indeed, are enormous differences between the two concepts of power. B. Power over nature and power over man. It is quite common and even fashionable to discuss market phenomena in terms of power, that is, in terms appropriate only to the battlefield. We have seen the fallacy of the back-to-the-jungle criticism of the market, and we have seen how the fallacious economic power concept has been applied to the exchange economy. Political power terminology, in fact, often dominates discussions of the market. Peaceful businessmen are economic royalists, economic feudalists, or robber barons. Business is called a system of power, and firms are private governments, and, if they are very large, even empires. Less luridly, men have bargaining power, and business firms engage in strategies and rivalry, as in military battles. Recently, theories of games and strategy have been erroneously applied to market activity, even to the absurd extent of comparing market exchange with a zero-sum game, an interrelation in which A's loss is precisely equal to B's gain. This, of course, is the action of coercive power, of conquest and robbery. There, one man's gain is another man's loss, one man's victory, another's defeat. Only conflict can describe these social relations, but the opposite is true on the free market, where everyone is a victor and everyone gains from social relations. The language and concepts of political power are singularly inappropriate in the free market society. The fundamental confusion here is the failure to distinguish between two very different concepts, power over nature and power over man. It is easy to see that an individual's power is his ability to control his environment in order to satisfy his wants. A man with an axe has the power to chop down a tree. A man with a factory has the power, along with other complementary factors, to produce capital goods. A man with a gun has the power to force an unarmed man to do his bidding, provided that the unarmed man chooses not to resist or not to accept death at gunpoint. It should be clear that there is a basic distinction between the two types of power. Power over nature is the sort of power on which civilization must be built. The record of man's history is the record of the advance or attempted advance of that power. Power over men, on the other hand, does not raise the general standard of living or promote the satisfactions of all, as does power over nature. By its very essence, only some men in society can wield power over men. Where power over man exists, some must be the powerful, and others must be objects of power. But every man can and does achieve power over nature. In fact, if we look at the basic condition of man as he enters the world, it is obvious that the only way to preserve his life and advance himself is to conquer nature, to transform the face of the earth to satisfy his wants. From the point of view of all the members of the human race, it is obvious that only such a conquest is productive and life-sustaining. Power of one man over another cannot contribute to the advance of mankind. It can only bring about a society in which plunder has replaced production, hegemony has supplanted contract, violence and conflict have taken the place of the peaceful order and harmony of the market. Power of one man over another is parasitic rather than creative, for it means that the nature conquerors are subjected to the dictation of those who conquer their fellow man instead. Any society of force, whether ruled by criminal bands or by an organized state, fundamentally means the rule of the jungle, or economic chaos. Furthermore, it would be a jungle, a struggle in the sense of the social Darwinists, in which the survivors would not really be the fittest, for the fitness of the victors would consist solely in their ability to prey on producers. They would not be the ones best fitted for advancing the human species. These are the producers, the conquerors of nature. The libertarian doctrine, then, advocates the maximization of man's power over nature and the eradication of the power of man over man. Statists, in elevating the latter power, often fail to realize that in their system, man's power over nature would wither and become negligible. Albert J. Nock was aiming at this dichotomy when, in Our Enemy the State, he distinguished between social power and state power. Those who properly balk at any terms that seem to anthropomorphize society were wary of accepting this terminology, but actually this distinction is a very important one. Nock's social power is society's, mankind's, conquest of nature, the power that has helped to produce the abundance that man has been able to wrest from the earth. His state power is political power, the use of the political means as against the economic means to wealth. State power is the power of man over man, the wielding of coercive violence by one group over another. Nock used these categories to analyze historical events in brilliant fashion. He saw the history of mankind as a race between social power and state power. Always man, led by the producers, has tried to advance the conquest of his natural environment. And always men, other men, have tried to extend political power in order to seize the fruits of this conquest over nature. History can then be interpreted as a race between social power and state power. In the more abundant periods, for example after the Industrial Revolution, social power takes a large spurt ahead of political power, which has not yet had a chance to catch up. The stagnant periods are those in which state power has at last come to extend its control over the newer areas of social power. State power and social power are antithetical, and the former subsists by draining the latter. Clearly, the concepts advanced here, power over nature and power over man, are generalizations and clarifications of Knox categories. One problem may appear puzzling. What is the nature of purchasing power on the market? Is this not power over man, and yet social and on the free market? However, this contradiction is only apparent. Money has purchasing power only because other men are willing to accept it in exchange for goods. That is, because they are eager to exchange. The power to exchange rests on both sides of the exchange on production, and this is precisely the conquest of nature that we have been discussing. In fact, it is the exchange process, the division of labor, that permits man's power over nature to extend beyond the primitive level. It was power over nature that the Ford Motor Company had developed in such abundance, and it was this power that the angry job seeker was threatening to seize by political power, while complaining about Ford's economic power. In sum, political power terminology should be applied only to those employing violence. The only private governments are those people and organizations aggressing against persons and property that are not part of the official state, dominating certain territory. These private states, or private governments, may either cooperate with the official state, as did the governments of the guilds in the Middle Ages, and as labor unions and cartelists do today, or they may compete with the official state and be designated as criminals or bandits. 12. The problem of luck. A common criticism of free market decisions is that luck plays too great a role in determining incomes. Even those who concede that income to a factor tends to equal its discounted marginal value product to consumers, and that entrepreneurs on the free market will reduce mistakes to an absolute minimum, add that luck still plays a role in income determination. After charging that the market confers undue laurels on the lucky, the critic goes on to call for expropriation of the rich, or lucky, and subsidization of the poor, or unlucky. Yet how can luck be isolated and identified? It should be evident that it is impossible to do so. In every market action, luck is interwoven inextricably and is impossible to isolate. Consequently, there is no justification for saying that the rich are luckier than the poor. It might very well be that many or most of the rich have been unlucky and are getting less than their true DMVP, while most of the poor have been lucky and are getting more. No one can say what the distribution of luck is. Hence, there is no justification here for a redistribution policy. In only one place on the market does luck purely and identifiably determine the result: gambling gains and losses. Here we refer to pure gambling, or games of chance, such as roulette, with no intermingled elements of skill, such as in racetrack betting. But is this what the statist critics really want? Confiscation of the gains of gambling winners in order to pay gambling losers. This would mean, of course, the speedy death of gambling, except as an illegal activity, for there would obviously be no point in continuing the games. Presumably, even the losers would object to being compensated, for they freely and voluntarily accepted the rules of chance before beginning to gamble. The governmental policy of neutralizing luck destroys the satisfaction that all the participants derive from the game. It is curious that so many economists, including Alfred Marshall, have proved the irrationality of gambling, for example, from the diminishing marginal utility of money, by first assuming, clearly erroneously, that the participants do not like to gamble. 13. The traffic manager analogy. Because of its popularity, we may briefly consider the traffic manager analogy, the doctrine that the government must obviously regulate the economy just as traffic must be regulated. It is high time that this flagrant non sequitur be consigned to oblivion. Every owner necessarily regulates his own property. In the same way, every owner of a road will lay down the rules for the use of his road. Far from being an argument for statism, management is simply the attribute of all ownership. Those who own the roads will regulate their use. In the present day, the government owns most roads, and so regulates them. In a purely free market society, private owners would operate and control their own roads. Obviously, the traffic manager analogy can furnish no argument against the purely free market. 14. Over and under development. Critics often level conflicting charges against the free market. The historicist-minded may concede that the free market is ideal for a certain stage of economic development, but insist that it is unsuited to other stages. Thus, advanced nations have been exhorted to embrace government planning because the modern economy is too complex to remain planless. The frontier is gone, and the economy is now mature. But, on the other hand, the backward countries have been told that they must adopt statist planning methods because of their relatively primitive state. So, any given economy is either too advanced or too backward for laissez-faire, and we may rest assured that the appointed moment for laissez-faire somehow never arrives. The currently fashionable economics of growth is an historicist regression. The laws of economics apply whatever the particular level of the economy. At any level, progressive change consists in a growing volume of capital per head of population and is furthered by the free market, low time preferences, far-seeing entrepreneurs, and sufficient labor and natural resources. Regressive change is brought about by the opposite conditions. The terms progressive and regressive change are far better than growth, a term expressing a misleading biological analogy that implies some actual law dictating that an economy must grow continually, and even at a fixed rate. Actually, of course, an economy can just as easily grow backward. The term underdeveloped is also unfortunate, as it implies that there is some level or norm that the economy should have reached but failed to reach because some external force did not develop it. The old-fashioned term, backward, though still normative, at least pins the blame for the relative poverty of an economy on the nation's own policies. The poor country can best progress by permitting private enterprise and investment to function, and by allowing natives and foreigners to invest there unhampered and unmolested. As for the rich country and its complexities, the delicate processes of the free market are precisely equipped to handle complex adjustments and interrelations far more efficiently than any form of statist planning. 15. The State and the Nature of Man. Since the problem of the nature of man has been raised, we may now turn briefly to an argument that has pervaded Roman Catholic social philosophy, namely, that the state is part of the essential nature of man. This Thomistic view stems from Aristotle and Plato, who, in their quest for a rational ethic, leaped to the assumption that the state was the embodiment of the moral agency for mankind. That man should do such and such quickly became translated into the prescription, the state should do such and such. But nowhere is the nature of the state itself fundamentally examined. Typical is a work very influential in Catholic circles, Heinrich Roman's The State in Catholic Thought. Following Aristotle, Roman attempts to ground the state in the nature of man by pointing out that man is a social being. In proving that man's nature is best fitted for a society, he believes that he has gone far to provide a rationale for the state. But he has not done so in the slightest degree, once we fully realize that the state and society are by no means coextensive. The contention of libertarians that the state is an anti-social instrument must first be refuted before such a non sequitur can be allowed. Roman recognizes that the state and society are distinct, but he still justifies the state by arguments that apply only to society. He also asserts the importance of law, although the particular legal norms considered necessary are unfortunately not specified. Yet law and the state are not coextensive either, although this is a fallacy that very few writers avoid. Much Anglo-Saxon law grew out of the voluntarily adopted norms of the people themselves, common law, law merchant, etc., not as state legislation. Roman also stresses the importance for society of the predictability of action, which can be assured only by the state. Yet the essence of human nature is that it cannot be considered as truly predictable. Otherwise, we should be dealing not with free men, but with an ant-heap. And if we could force men to march in unison according to a complete set of predictable norms, it is certainly not a foregone conclusion that we should all hail such an ideal. Some people would combat it bitterly. Finally, if the enforceable norm were limited to abstinence from aggression against others, 1. A state is not necessary for such enforcement, as we have noted, and 2. The state's own inherent aggression itself violates that norm. 16. Human rights and property rights. It is often asserted by critics of the free market economy that they are interested in preserving human rights rather than property rights. This artificial dichotomy between human and property rights has often been refuted by libertarians, who have pointed out, A, that property rights of course accrue to humans and to humans alone, and B, that the human right to life requires the right to keep what one has produced to sustain and advance life. In short, they have shown that property rights are indissolubly also human rights. They have, besides, pointed out that the human right of a free press would be only a mockery in a socialist country, where the state owns and decides upon the allocation of newsprint and other newspaper capital. There are other points that should be made, however. For not only are property rights also human rights, but, in the most profound sense, there are no rights but property rights. The only human rights, in short, are property rights. There are several senses in which this is true. In the first place, each individual, as a natural fact, is the owner of himself, the ruler of his own person. The human rights of the person that are defended in the purely free market society are, in effect, each man's property right in his own being, and from this property right stems his right to the material goods that he has produced. In the second place, alleged human rights can be boiled down to property rights, although in many cases this fact is obscured. Take, for example, the human right of free speech. Freedom of speech is supposed to mean the right of everyone to say whatever he likes. But the neglected question is, where? Where does a man have this right? He certainly does not have it on property on which he is trespassing. In short, he has this right only either on his own property or on the property of someone who has agreed, as a gift or in a rental contract, to allow him on the premises. In fact, then, there is no such thing as a separate right to free speech. There is only a man's property right, the right to do as he wills with his own, or to make voluntary agreements with other property owners. The concentration on vague and wholly human rights has not only obscured this fact, but has led to the belief that there are, of necessity, all sorts of conflicts between individual rights and alleged public policy, or the public good. These conflicts have, in turn, led people to contend that no rights can be absolute, that they must all be relative and tentative. Take, for example, the human right of freedom of assembly. Suppose that a citizens group wishes to demonstrate for a certain measure. It uses a street for this purpose. The police, on the other hand, break up the meeting on the ground that it obstructs traffic. Now, the point is that there is no way of resolving this conflict except arbitrarily, because the government owns the streets. Government ownership, as we have seen, inevitably breeds insoluble conflicts. For, on the one hand, the citizens group can argue that they are taxpayers and are therefore entitled to use the streets for assembly, while, on the other hand, the police are right that traffic is obstructed. There is no rational way to resolve the conflict because there is, as yet, no true ownership of the valuable street resource. In a purely free society, where the streets are privately owned, the question would be simple. It would be for the street owner to decide, and it would be the concern of the citizens group to try to rent the street space voluntarily from the owner. If all ownership were private, it would be quite clear that the citizens did not have any nebulous right of assembly. Their right would be the property right of using their money in an effort to buy or rent space on which to make their demonstration, and they could do so only if the owner of the street agreed to the deal. Let us consider finally the classic case that is supposed to demonstrate that individual rights can never be absolute, but must be limited by public policy. Justice Holmes' famous dictum that no man can have the right to cry fire in a crowded theater. This is supposed to show that freedom of speech cannot be absolute. But if we cease dealing with this alleged human right and seek for the property rights involved, the solution becomes clear, and we see that there is no need at all to weaken the absolute nature of rights. For the person who falsely cries fire must be either the owner or the owner's agent or a guest or paying patron. If he is the owner, then he has committed fraud upon his customers. He has taken their money in exchange for a promise to put on a motion picture, and now, instead, he disrupts the performance by falsely shouting "Fire!" and creating a disturbance among the patrons. He has thus willfully defaulted on his contractual obligation and has therefore violated the property rights of his patrons. Suppose, on the other hand, that the shouter is not the owner, but a patron. In that case, he is obviously violating the property right of the theater owner as well as the other patrons. As a guest, he is on the property on certain terms, and he has the obligation of not violating the owner's property rights by disrupting the performance that the owner is putting on for the patrons. The person who maliciously cries "Fire!" in a crowded theater, therefore, is a criminal not because his so-called right of free speech must be pragmatically restricted on behalf of the so-called public good, but because he has clearly and obviously violated the property rights of another human being. There is no need, therefore, of placing limits upon these rights. Since this is a praxeological and not an ethical treatise, the aim of this discussion has not been to convince the reader that property rights should be upheld. Rather, we have attempted to show that the person who does wish to construct his political theory on the basis of rights must not only discard the spurious distinction between human rights and property rights, but also realize that the former must all be absorbed into the latter.